Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Hare 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 Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Hare Krishna, Hare Hare, 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 Hare Hare Krishna, Hare Hare. Shri Yogananda, guide to inner freedom, steal into my heart of hearts, banish my delusions. Shri Yogananda, guide to inner freedom, steal into my heart of hearts, banish my delusions. Shri Yogananda, guide to inner freedom, steal into my heart of hearts, banish my delusions. Shri Yogananda, guide to inner freedom, steal into my heart of hearts, banish my delusions. Steal into my heart of hearts, banish my delusions. Steal into my heart of hearts, banish my delusions. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Paramahansa Yogananda, Saints of all paths, we bow before you. Beloved Masters, thank you for your presence in our lives. Thank you for this opportunity to dive deep into these sacred teachings. Help us to draw from the Mahabharata profound understanding of life's patterns, of how we awaken. Help us to cooperate with that awakening, that we live in Thy joy, that we live in Thy love. Om, peace, amen. Good evening, everybody. How are you all? Oh, good. I'm so glad. Yes. So who was not here last week? Holy smokes. And of those who were not here, who does not know the Mahabharata? Yeah, okay. No, yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, rewind. That's important. We're going to review anyway. So we'll try and just make sure that we do it in a way that embraces a little bit more of the story. The Mahabharata, to recap from last week. By the way, is this annoying or is this helpful? Okay. Give you something besides me to look at periodically. Good idea. The Mahabharata is one of the two great epic stories that have been handed down from the last high ages. There are two cultures on the planet right now that hold keys to the future of the planet, actually. One of them is India. India is the oldest culture on the planet. It is the only culture that has survived from the last high ages. And the high ages are when everybody just simply knows what's going on. They know where truth really comes from. They know what's real. As the yugas descended, as the ages descended from Sat Yuga, from the high ages down, less and less was it possible for the common person, the souls that would incarnate. It's like, as winter sets in, it's less and less possible for flowers to bloom, for plants to grow. And so what you see is a darkening. Well, the same thing is true of consciousness. And as we go from Sat Yuga down into Kali Yuga, the capacity for people to know what's going on becomes increasingly limited. And India has held stewardship of the understandings of life and truth from the last high ages all the way down through the descending ages. Now, it doesn't mean that they've held on to it on the surface well. A lot of truths have gotten distorted, in fact, including the cycles of time. The common understanding in India is that Kali Yuga will reign for another 400 and some odd thousand years, which is a fairly depressing thought. But people behave culturally as if that's so, and so you don't expect more. Even though Dwapara Yuga, this age of energy, is swirling all around, there's a lot of commitment to a lesser thing. And if you are in a descending age, what is the hallmark of a descending age? Where do you look for wisdom? Backward. So it's always, that's not how my father did it. That's not how we did it in the past. The other culture, and that's a real thing, that's a legitimate point of reference. So the other culture on the planet, really, that is guiding, so that those high truths that were as the ages descended and it was becoming less and less possible, things started to be written down, they started to be codified. And so you have the Upanishads, you have the Vedas, you have these great scriptural embodiments of what was an intuitive truth and profound understanding as a way of pointing back toward what it can look like. The Ramayana and the Mahabharata are two of those. What you see, we'll come back to America, we'll come back to that other culture in a minute, but what you see is that when there is a transition of age, when we go really formally from one age to the next, tremendous chaos happens. It's like having a hall monitor in school when the bell rings. Because there's an awful lot of confusion, there's an awful lot going on. In class, everything's kind of ordered and you kind of know what's going on, you kind of know what's expected and what's trying to happen. And so during Kali Yuga souls are born. When Dwapara Yuga souls are born. They know what the lesson is. They know what's trying to happen. They know why they're there. And everybody's kind of working on it. But when you have these class filing out, class filing in, some people don't want to leave. Some, it becomes very chaotic. And you see those are times when great avatars come. Now, my understanding is that Rama, the one epic of India, is the Ramayana. And it's about Rama, who is an avatar. And Rama was, my best understanding is it was between Treta Yuga and Dwapara Yuga descending, about 5,000 years ago. Okay? And it's a great epic. There's so much truth. He was an avatar. And there was so much truth woven through the story of his life. And even hearing how that story came out through Valmiki is a great study. It's a great thing, but that's not what we're doing tonight. But there's another lore, another tradition has it that Rama's story was from descending Sat Yuga into Treta Yuga. And just to give an idea of how subtle these things are, it's said in that tradition that Rama was ruling. It was after the big battle and after the whole thing. He was ruling, and the kingdom was bathed in goodness, but it was a descending age. He sent his ministers out throughout the kingdom to see how the kingdom was doing. And they came back and they all said, everything's just fine, everything's wonderful, people are living in harmony, there's prosperity, there's virtue, except one minister, and he said everything was fine except that he heard one argument between a fisherman and his wife. And a shadow crossed Rama's face, and he said he was sorry to hear that because that meant that Treta Yuga was beginning. One argument. Think about that. In the high ages, harmony rules. Well, in this age of descending Dwapara Yuga into Kali Yuga, Krishna was incarnated. Because what you had is very similar to what we have right now on the planet. Okay, you guys? It's a lovely Krishna doll. Do you want to share? Would you show everybody? Because it's very sweet. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Yes, I can tell. Okay. So, Krishna incarnated. What you had was a caste of warrior kings that ruled India. And they were very powerful, and in the early ages they were very noble, but as time was passing and getting closer to Kali Yuga, they were becoming more avaricious and more self-involved and more egoistic and more divisive. And his job, Krishna's job, was to come and wipe out the entire race of Kshatriya warrior kings, get them off the planet, to usher in a new but lower age. Why would that be? Picture, you've got these warrior kings, all this power, and you'll hear about these astral weapons that they use, and it'd be similar to weapons of mass destruction that we have right now coming into Dwapara Yuga. We're beginning to become aware of very subtle energies that we can use that have tremendous repercussions. So you've got all these warrior kings and all this power and knowledge, and you're coming into a lower age. It's all about divisiveness and combativeness and war and destruction. Why would you have to get them off? To clear away from the new age, because in a low age, people are always whacking each other. That's what you do. And if it's just a bow and arrow or a hatchet or a sword or something, I mean, it's a little hard on the two people that are in it or the people that are in it, but just affects a very small microcosm. But when you start whacking at each other with nukes or weapons of mass destruction, the planet can't take it. So you have to get them off so that you can have this lower age. It's a different classroom. And just like what's happening now, we have all this selfishness and self-righteousness and arrogance and separation and only the Taliban's good, only ISIS is good, and boo Muslims, yay Muslims, boo Christians, all the things. And people are playing it out at a terribly violent level, which is fine as long as it's, little cap guns and stuff. But the second you introduce nukes, the second you introduce weapons of mass destruction, the second you introduce these other things, the planet can't tolerate it. So we have to get the Kali Yuga consciousness off now. That's what's happening, you're seeing. You have to get people who have the limited and divisive consciousness off the planet so you can have a new and higher age. And the new and higher age is represented by Ananda, it's represented by all of you, it's represented by, this universal sense of family and friendship and kindness and goodness and drawing on the differences instead of seeing the differences as being something that's a problem. So the United States was born, when was the United States born? 1776. Good, gold star. Okay, gold star, 1776. What happened right about that time? Oh, yeah, but relative to the large cycle of yugas. Yeah. So the United States was born to usher in a new age. Where do we look in the United States for understanding? We look forward. We know that tomorrow is going to be better, right? So you have this tremendous ancient understanding being applied through the anticipation of growing back into that understanding. Okay? And where is the great yogic center in the world right now? United States. That's where yoga is getting the focus of attention. It's not India anymore. India still holds the tradition, but this is where the focus of attention is, because people can see that through base materialism, this is where it's going. Anyway, the Mahabharata, as India saw, as these great sages saw that we were sinking into darkness and nobody would really know, one great soul realized that he had the capacity to encode, to capture the essence of spirituality in a way, in metaphor, in story, in allegory, in a way that people would understand, could feel it, even though their minds couldn't tune into it. And he took the story of Krishna, he took the story of that great battle of cleaning off the planet, and he realized that he could weave into it all the basic fundamental understanding of spiritual growth and spirituality into that story. And so he did, and we told the story. It's very cute. I'll just do it very, very summarily. Anyway, he could tell he was going to channel it. It's the longest poem in any human language. It's 100,000 verses. And he knew in channeling it, it was going to be very hard to channel it and write it down. So he went to the gods, and he went to the scribe of the gods, which is Ganesha, and he said, would you be our scribe? Would you write this down for me? And Ganesha said, sure, on one condition. He said, you must never stop talking. You must never make me wait, is what he said. And 100,000 verses, I mean, this is a big endeavor, and to do it unbroken. So Vyasa, who's the sage, he was smart enough, he went, okay, but the deal is, you must understand what you're writing. And so he bought himself little windows of time in that way. So the gods are already woven in. It starts off, and the other part of this is that the Bhagavad Gita is the Hindu Bible, and there is more spiritual clarity and purity and beauty in the Bhagavad Gita than virtually any other script, probably any other script on the planet. And it's just one tiny little slice, one tiny little chapter from the story of the Mahabharata. And it's by itself, it's magic. But when you get it in context, because it happens at a particular time in this epic story, you get it in context and all of a sudden it makes far more sense. This is an allegory of you. This is you coming out from God, being born, beginning to develop different qualities. The qualities come into conflict with each other. Anybody got a feeling for the qualities that come in conflict with each other? Inside of you? Yeah? Got a feeling for that? Okay. What are the two different primary movements of energy? Light and dark. Downward into the world. Commitment to a lower energy that wants this dream to be real. And the other wants to aspire back into the experience of our oneness with Spirit and who we truly are. And those two forces vie against each other. And that is the dream of creation. That is what's going on. And so that's the story that's woven in. And then, of course, who's victorious in the end? The light is victorious in the end, but it's very close. It's never easy, right? Okay, which makes a great story. And so the Mahabharata is that epic story. And he took and he used real figures and then he wove in a whole lot of other figures. Those figures are the qualities of our own consciousness. Okay? So it starts off. This great and noble king is ruling the kingdom. Everything's perfect. His name is Santanu. He represents God the Father. Everything's perfect, except what do kings need to do? They conquer territories, and they need to have sons so that they can carry on the tradition. They can carry on the lineage. And everything's fine except, and that's what you'll hear, except that he has no sons. He has no sons. Why? Because he has no partner. So he ties up, God the Father ties up with Divine Mother. Ganga shows up, and they fall in love instantly. It's down by the river Ganges, and Ganga makes a deal with him before they get married. He must never question anything she does. And he's so smitten. So all of you, before you're married, think about this. Get the deal. Get the prenup. So he's so smitten, he says, okay. They get married. She gets pregnant. Everything's wonderful, but she gets pregnant, and she goes down to the river and drowns the kid. Well, there goes the heir, the first heir. But he loves her, and he doesn't say anything. Does it a second time, does it a third time, does it 7 times. And then, by the time she's pregnant with the 8th one, he can't help himself. And he goes, as she goes to carry the 8th child out, he says, what are you doing? And she says, I'm sorry, our marriage is now over. And then she tells him that she's actually a goddess. She's the goddess Ganga. And she's not mortal at all. And she tells the story of how there were, in the heavenly realms, there were these 8 Vasus, celestial beings, and they got in trouble. They did something really silly and got cursed by a rishi, had to be born on earth. But the rishi mitigated the curse and said that they didn't have to live very long. All except one. And that was the one who laid his hands on the cow. They stole a cow. So anyway, she says, this one will have to live a long time. I will take him back. He will be perfectly trained in the heavenly realms to be your heir. And she steps into the water. So she was actually, part of the teaching in that is that we don't know what's going on. The things that we think are so tragic often have a subplot that's to everybody's benefit. And if we had a bigger picture, we would simply know how to cooperate. So learning how to cooperate with life and what it presents is a part of the storyline. There's always more going on, and the divine realms are always involved in our lives. So she takes the child, steps into the river. 16 years later, she brings him back, and he's perfectly trained. He's half divine. He's perfectly trained to be the heir, and everything's going fine, except, and he becomes the Yuvraj, the heir apparent, except that Santanu falls in love with somebody else. And the deal to marry her is that her sons have to be the heir to the kingdom. Well, Ganga's son, Devavrata, hears of this. He goes, he tries to negotiate the marriage, and the father of the girl won't agree to anything except this condition, so Devavrata says, fine, I give up the kingdom, let him rule. And which is, here he was on the verge of being the king. And he just gives it all up for his father's happiness. But then the Fisher King says, oh, but what if your children should contest the throne, the right of the throne, with her children? And so he says, for my father's happiness, fine. I will never marry. I will never have anything to do with women. In this one moment, he's a young man, he's 20 years old. He gives up all normal human life. And the heavens open up, and they ring out the word Bhishma. And these flower petals fall. Bhishma means terrible vow. He's done this terrible vow. He takes the girl back, they get married, but Dad feels really bad, and he gives him a blessing. He says, you've given up so much for my happiness, I give you a boon, that nothing will ever be able to kill you. You must give up your own life. Okay? Bhishma represents your ego. It's divine, it's glorious, it has a long life, and nothing can kill it. It has to give itself up. But you'll also notice it doesn't really matter whether you're married or whether you're not, no matter what's happening, you always feel separate. You always feel individual. You never really marry. The warmest and richest human love, for a time, feels like it expands our reality, but at some point it shrinks back down to our own self-identity. The ego is always, so that's the metaphor in here. And then time goes on. He ends up, Dad dies, there's a couple kids in there, a lot of things happen, but Bhishma always ends up having to rule the kingdom. Even though he's renounced it, he ends up always having to rule it, which is again another spiritual secret, that what you renounce comes back to you. Okay? And he doesn't really want it anymore. He's lost a lot of interest in this world. But there it is. And in the course of time, what happens is and we don't have time to go into the details of it, but in the course of time, what happens is there are some scions of the royal house. And Bhishma is still acting as steward for the kingdom. But we end up with a blind son who's the eldest, and a pale son who is just a little bit younger, and then a relative who is Vidura. So you end up with Dhritarashtra, who's the blind king. And you end up with Pandu, who is the pale. And it's pale, and it's noted because this is a country of dark-skinned people. Somebody pale is very odd. And he represents, we'll talk about what he represents here in just a minute. And then Vidura, the wise counselor. So we have Dhritarashtra, Pandu, and Vidura being guided by Bhishma. And they grow up, and they get married, and especially the sons of Dhritarashtra and the sons of Pandu are the storyline. It's what the storyline is about now. And they represent, Dhritarashtra represents the blind mind. The mind blinded by desire, the mind blinded by materialism. And Pandu represents pure discriminating intelligence, the capacity to discern. And then Vidura represents wisdom. Okay? Now, where we got to in the story was that Dhritarashtra got married, but not to a very noble woman. Her name is Gandhari. And she bound her eyes on the day of her wedding to never be able to see, so she never had an advantage that her husband didn't also have. Tremendous nobility. Pandu ended up with 2 wives. One was Kunti, very noble young woman who has a secret, and Madri, also another very noble young woman. Things are doing fine. Pandu's conquering kingdoms. Dhritarashtra's at home with Vidura and Bhishma ruling the kingdom. Things are great. And one day, Pandu and his wives are out in the woods. They're taking a little vacation because it's been a big campaign. And Pandu does something really silly. He's a warrior, but he's also a hunter. And he's hunting for dinner, and he sees a buck, this stag. And he... so magnificent a beast, he decides to shoot it. The problem is that the stag is mating with a doe, and it's a warrior's code, hunter's code, that you never shoot an animal when it's distracted in this way. But he's so taken with the hunt, he just isn't really kind of acting appropriately, shoots the stag, and to his horror, what happens is as the stag falls dying, what happens? He turns into a great rishi. This rishi and his wife had taken animal form to sport in the woods, and here it is, he has killed this rishi in this ignoble way. And as the rishi falls dying, he looks up and he looks at Pandu, he says, "You knew better." He says, what do rishis do when they're crossed? They curse. So he says, "I curse you now that if you ever come across, ever come to a woman in this arduous mood that I was in, you will instantly die." It includes his wives. It includes everything. I mean, this is a bad curse. and Pandu has just lost a lot of interest in life. And he says, "Send a message back to my father, or my uncle, Bhishma, and my brother. We're not coming back. We're going to stay here with the rishis in the woods." Dang. Once again, Bhishma is having to rule the kingdom. He's still got a wise counselor, he's got a blind king, but it doesn't really work because a blind king can't really rule effectively. But things are going along and everything's fine, except what does Pandu want? He wants sons. He wants sons because he's a king. But of course, he can't have sons because he's cursed. So he's trying to get, there's this injunction in the scriptures that says, if a man can't have a lineage through his wife, the brother of the man can have a lineage through his wife to carry on the lineage. And so he's working on, or a rishi can, and he's working on Kunti to have a child by a rishi to continue the lineage. She says, absolutely not. And then she tells the story, she tells him that she's got the secret. Who remembers what the secret is?
The secret is that she can call upon a God and she can have a baby.
That's right. And she knows this because when she was a young woman, the great Rishi had come through the kingdom, had given her this mantra. She had used it thinking that it would just call a God to be with her, not realizing that it would call a God to be with her. And so she calls on the God of the sun, and she ends up pregnant. But it's a miraculous birth. Happens instantly. She goes back to being a virgin. It's a very short gestation of a few hours. But she can't keep the child. She's just 14, and it would ruin the family's name. It would ruin her life. And so she takes this beautiful child, the son of the God of the sun, with the golden earrings and golden shield on his chest, places him in a box and sets him into the river, weeping the while with these tears, these hot tears of remorse and sadness and regret, but knowing there's nothing else she could do, and also saying, I will recognize you someday. I will see you again, and I will recognize you by your golden earrings and your golden shield. She lets him go. So she knows that there's this mantra, and she knows it works. She doesn't tell him the story about the sun. Nobody knows that except a rishi and the God of the sun. But she tells him that she knows this mantra. They invoke the God of dharma, righteousness, and the God of death. It's the same. It's Yama. And they invoke him, and she gives birth to Yudhishthira. And he is the most righteous soul to ever inhabit the earth. And by golly, Pandu's pretty impressed with this, and he says, okay, let's do it again. And they invoke the God of the wind, okay, Vayu, and he's this powerful force, and they have another child, and this is Bhima. He's the second. Same day Bhima is born, Gandhari and Dhritarashtra have a child. And there are dark and heavy omens around this birth. And in fact, it's not just one child, and I don't have time to go into the story, but it's a very bizarre circumstance. But she gives birth to this mass, this dark and putrid mass, and the sage shows up at this point. They go to get rid of it, and he cuts it up into 100 pieces, puts them into these vats, and they become the 100 sons of Gandhari and Dhritarashtra. And the biggest chunk, it becomes the eldest son, born the same time as Bhima, and it is Duryodhana. And Duryodhana and his 99 brothers and one sister. Why, I don't know. Anyway, but there's one sister in there. Anyway, they have this birth, but there's such dark omens that the sage says, it is said, he says, the omens say that this eldest son, Duryodhana, will be the death of all your sons. You should kill him while you can. And it says in the scriptures that a son can be sacrificed for the sake of a family for the sake of the village, a village for the sake of the country. And Dhritarashtra hears this. He and Gandhari know that it's true, but they don't have what it takes to do it. And so Duryodhana survives. He represents material desire, born of the blind mind. Okay, if we could get rid of material desire when it's young, we'd be okay, right? And who's the second oldest brother in that lineage? Dusasana. And they are always together. Duryodhana and Dusasana, they're inseparable because wherever desire goes, anger follows. Okay. Back to Pandu. Pandu, and Dhritarashtra and Gandhari, they've got plenty to do. They got a lot of kids now, so that's taken care of. Pandu says, we need more. So they invoke the god of the heavens, Indra. And he is storm clouds, and he is power. He's the Lord of the heavens. And the most powerful warrior, the most refined warrior is born, and that's Arjuna. Now it's interesting. This story brings in Krishna later on, and he's related to everybody. But Krishna is reincarnated as Babaji in this time. And Arjuna is reincarnated as who? Paramahansa Yogananda. So this is not only a story from out there, this is actually also a story of our lineage, and it's very interesting that as we were going from Dwapara down into Kali, who was there? Krishna and Arjuna. As we're coming back up into Dwapara out of Kali, who's here? Arjuna and Krishna. Okay, those same souls, time and time again they come to bring light into the planet when there's deep need. So Pandu's having a lot of fun with this, not as much fun as he'd like to have, but it's way more fun than not having boys and kids. So he says, let's do it again. And Kunti says, what's you hear repeated again and again, which is desperate measures are allowed 3 times, not more. She says, I'm not doing this again. And so Pandu's a little frustrated. He's got hunger for offspring, for scions of the house. So then he thinks, he goes, aha, but Madri doesn't have any kids. Teach her the mantra. And so she teaches Madri the mantra. Madri invokes the Aswini twins. The Aswini twins are the gods of music and dance and medicine and healing and the arts. And they're invoked, and then Madri gives birth to Nakula and Sahadev. And they're the most beautiful and the wisest. And time passes, and the boys are all growing up. Dhritarashtra's sons are growing up in the kingdom, and they just feel like this is theirs. They're the heirs. It's so obvious that they will inherit the kingdom. And they kind of know that there's some cousins someplace way off, but they're off in the woods. Pandu and his sons are off in the woods, and time is passing, and they're being trained by the rishis, and they're half divine, and they're powerful, and they're noble. And 16 years into the story of the kids being there, and one day it's spring and it's beautiful, and Pandu can't help himself, and he's kind of forgotten a little bit about the curse, and he chases Madri, and as soon as he catches up with her, he falls down dead. Okay, now that's where we are in the story. That brings us current. Okay? Now there's a story I didn't tell you that actually we need to step sideways, and I need to introduce because these characters start to show up, and they're relevant. Pandu, by the way, Pandu's sons, Yudhishthira represents this chakra, Bhima this chakra, Arjuna this chakra of self-control, and then Nakula and Sahadev the lower 2 chakras. Okay, Niyama and Yama. So these are the forces that work on our behalf for upliftment, whereas Duryodhana's sons represent all of the qualities that are attached to this world. Okay? So greed and avarice and selfishness and envy and all of those, and malice, and all of those are woven in, starting with, of course, material attachment and anger. And then we'll come back to Kunti's first son. But we'll tell that in a little bit, because he shows up too in the story. But there's a whole kingdom going on. And there's a character that we need to know about. His name is Drona. And Drona was the son of a Brahmin. And it was common in that time that Kshatriya, warrior kings, would send their sons to be trained in nobility and righteousness in the ashrams of Brahmins, of particular Brahmins who had great nobility and great wisdom. And Drona's father was one of those. And so Drupada's father sent Drupada to be trained for a number of years in the ashram of Drona's father. And the Brahmins were not particularly wealthy, and it was true, of course, of Drona's family. But Drona and Drupada became best of friends, boon companions. And in the course of time, as young men and boys are wont to do, Drupada made a promise to Drona, and he said, when I am king, my friend, I will share with you half of my kingdom. And Drona felt really good about this. It felt appropriate because they were that kind of boon companions. And in the course of time, Drupada went back to the kingdom. Drona grew up. And Drona had an abiding desire. Drona had an abiding desire to become a past master of the arts of war. And he went, when he grew up, he got married. And he had a child, but he, as this happened, he went looking for a guru who could teach him all the arts of the war. He wanted to become completely masterful. And he was taken on, I think it was by Bhargava, and he was trained, and he was the most powerful and skilled warrior ever to be trained. And it took years, but finally he learned everything that he could possibly learn. And he went back to his home where his wife and his child were, and he was walking through the little village, and his little son came up to him and said, "Daddy, what's milk?" And his father said, "Well, why do you ask?" And he says, "Because all the boys and girls in the village are making fun of me. They talk about this milk that I've never had. And they say how wonderful it is, but nobody's ever given me any, and I don't know what it is. Can you tell me?" And he realized that his family is desperately poor, and that he has to take on the dharma of providing an income for his family. It's no longer appropriate. So he goes, and he goes back to his friend, Drupada, who has now become the king. And he goes to Drupada, and he arrives at the kingdom, and he goes to the palace, and he says to the guard there, he says, and he's just a mendicant, he's just a Brahmin, and he's dressed very poorly and very humbly. And the guard says, "Who are you, and what do you want at the palace?" He says, "Go and tell the king that his best friend has arrived." The guard says, "You're kidding me." He says, "No, tell him Drona is waiting and is here to greet him as a friend." And so the guard goes to Drupada, and Drupada just simply waves him off. And Drona waits for days, and then finally has an audience. And Drupada's sitting in the throne, and he looks down at this humble Brahmin, and he says, "What do you want?" And Drona says, "My friend, I've come back. Do you remember the days we shared, and the fellowship, and the brotherhood, and the love we shared?" And Drupada says, "Friendship is only possible amongst equals, and you are clearly not my equal." And Drona is getting he's beginning to get a little bit uncomfortable with where this is going. He's been humiliated by having to wait. He came in good faith on the word of this great soul. He expected to be well received, and here he's being just put off. And he says, "My friend, when we were boys, you promised me half your kingdom." And Drupada, he's become arrogant and full of himself and a little bit self-involved, and he just says, and dismissive of the vows of childhood, and he says, the vows of childhood, kids say anything. And he basically sends Drona away. And Drona leaves, but Drona's a Brahmin. And Drona goes away with two things in his heart. One is a determination to find a position that will fulfill the need of his family and reflect the power of his training. And then the second one is what? He wants revenge. He wants revenge. So, we'll pick him up in a bit. But in the meantime, Pandu is dead. Madri has stepped on the funeral pyre with him. Kunti is left with these 5 remarkable sons. But everybody agrees that it's no longer appropriate for the boys and Kunti to stay where? In the forest with the rishis. So they gather themselves up and they simply head back. And it was not a time of internet and email and texting. So they just gather themselves up and they're walking back and they're going back to Hastinapura, their natural kingdom. And they arrive there, and there's this great stir because they weren't anticipated, and they're not really known. Everybody knows of them, but nobody knows them. And they arrive, and Dhritarashtra comes out and makes a great show of welcoming them into the kingdom. They hear what's happened. "Oh, poor Pandu is dead. The sons of my brother are like the sons of myself." And he welcomes them in as if they're part of the family. But inside, he's seething. And he's very uncomfortable. And so now what we have is this marriage of these two families. And you have to remember that who is the eldest of them all? Who's the eldest of them all? Yudhishthira is the eldest of them all, and it's not one of Dhritarashtra's sons. And because he's the eldest of that generation, he is the rightful king. Okay? So anyway, they come and they get folded into the family and things are doing fine, except that Duryodhana has a burning jealousy against all of the Pandavas, all of these 5 noble brothers, but especially against who? Bhima. Bhima was born on the same day. Bhima represents the high octave of the heart, and Duryodhana represents the low octave of the heart. Material desire, the desire for divine love. Okay, I love this world, I love God. These 2 forces are there, and they battle back and forth and back and forth. And Bhima's just huge, he's just enormous. And it's said that he's not only this enormous presence, and he's got more vitality than any 10 people, but he also has got an appetite as big as all outdoors. And it plays a role in the story because what happens is, whenever there's anything going on, Bhima just barges in and just dominates everybody and throws all the Kauravas around, and they all resent it. He's a good-natured bully. He doesn't do it because he's malicious. He just can't help himself. He's enthusiastic and enormous, and he just always dominates everything. But he mostly dominates Duryodhana, and Duryodhana hates him. And gradually what starts to build inside the kingdom is this seething hatred from the Kauravas toward the Pandavas. But mostly it's still innocent, and things are just kind of happening as they go along. But Bhima, in his guileless way, continues to dominate and brutalize Duryodhana so much that Duryodhana decides that his one burning desire in life is to what? Kill Bhima. He's going to get rid of Bhima because he just can't stand the presence of this big moronic force that keeps dominating him. And so he's stewing a lot, and he doesn't know what to do. And then his evil uncle Sukuni, the brother of Gandhari, shows up. And Sukuni, he's always wheedling in the background. He's always plotting in the background. He's very slimy. He's very slick. And he says to Duryodhana, well, why don't you simply do something about it? Duryodhana says, well, like what? He says, well, think about it. What could you do? And they hatch this plot to get rid of Bhima. Okay? And what they decide to do is they all decide to go out on a picnic. And this is going to be kind of the warriors' picnic. They're going to go out and they're going to have all these games. They're going to camp by the river. And they're going to have all these war games and stuff. But it's going to be all camaraderie. And it's just a great thing. They're going to do it for the weekend. And they head on out. And Duryodhana has created this great palatial tent set up and a place for them all to reside. And they all go there and they're having these great games and stuff. And at the end of the day, and again, Bhima's done it once again. He's humiliated everybody and dominated the field and stuff. But Duryodhana, for the first time, instead of being resentful and smoldering, he just says, Bhima, you are such a fine friend and a fine fellow. Why don't you just come over to my tent tonight for dinner? We'd love to just host you for dinner. And, Bhima's guileless, and he thinks, well, if he's not resentful, if Duryodhana's not resentful, he's my brother, he's my cousin, he's fine, sure, I'll just come over and we'll just have a nice meal together. But Duryodhana has hatched a plot, and he's laced the food with what? Poison. And so he feeds Bhima, and he feeds Bhima, and he feeds Bhima, and Bhima eats and eats and eats, and he takes in so much poison that he falls over, unconscious. And Duryodhana binds him up, takes him down to the river. It's a special part of the river where there's all these poisonous snakes, and he's placed poisonous stakes in the river too, so the poisonous stakes might puncture him, and the poisonous snakes will do it, and if he doesn't drown and the poison doesn't get in from the food, that the poisonous snakes or the stakes will get him. He's going to get rid of Bhima once and for all. And then they throw him into the river and erase the marks, go back up, and the next morning they simply go back, gather up, everybody gathers themselves up, they go back into Hastinapura. And brothers are all looking around, well, where's Bhima? And Duryodhana says, I don't know, I haven't seen him since last night at dinner, I think he must have ridden on ahead. And so, and he's tickled because Bhima has gone for the night, so that must mean it worked. Meanwhile, what's happened with Bhima is they threw him into the river, and he missed all the stakes. But all the snakes start gathering around. There's a big splash, and all the snakes gather around, and they start biting him. By some mysterious alchemy, the poison of the snakes is the antidote to the poison in the food. And Bhima starts to wake up, and he breaks his bonds that they've tied him with, and he starts decimating the snakes. He starts destroying all the snakes that are around. And finally, he does so much damage to the snake team that they go swimming down under the water to the snake king, the Naga king, and they say, there's this great human being, and we don't know what's going on, but he got thrown into the river, we were biting him, and all of a sudden he woke up, and he's just destroying us. He's decimating our ranks. And the Naga king, he goes, oh, I know who that must be. It could only be one soul. And so he says, stop fighting with him. That's Bhima. Bring him down here. He's our honored guest. So they go up, and they escort Bhima down under the water into the snake kingdom's kingdom. And there he's honored and respected. And the Naga king says, you're our honored guest, and I want to give you a boon. He says, I give you a boon now. A blessing. He says, I have this elixir, and for every draft you drink, it will make you as strong as 1,000 elephants. And Bhima looks over, and he just goes, great. And he drinks 8 drafts. And again, he falls over into a stupor and sleeps for 8 days. Meanwhile, what's happening in the kingdom? What's happening back in Hastinapura? Bhima's missing. And Kunti is wild with concern. And they talk amongst themselves, the Pandavas, Kunti, and the brothers that are remaining. And they know that Duryodhana is behind this. They know that Bhima would never stay away like this. And they know that... And finally Vidura shows up and he says, be quiet. You must not talk like this, and you must not confront them. Your sons have all been destined, it's been prophesied that they are destined for a long and glorious future. If you say something, Duryodhana will know that you know, and all of your lives will be in danger. He says, just be patient and say nothing. And time passes, and it's getting harder and harder, and all the rest of the brothers are threatening to go and confront Duryodhana and kill all the Kauravas, but of course it's just 4 brothers against 100. They know the odds aren't good. And then after 8 days, what happens? Bhima simply wakes up, swims to the surface of the water, walks out of the river, and does what? Meanwhile, Duryodhana, of course, is gloating. Oh, he's so sad, and Dhritarashtra is so sad. The poor Pandava son is gone, but of course they're inwardly rejoicing. Bhima simply walks back into the kingdom. But now it's not only Bhima, it's Bhima with the strength, his native strength plus the strength of 8,000 elephants. He is unstoppable. Plus, now what's worse is he knows. And Duryodhana knows that he knows. And so this incredible tension keeps growing. Meanwhile, Ambalika, and Satyavati, they hear Vyasa comes through. Her son comes through, and he says, you think it's bad so far. You've seen nothing. And they just decide they're going to go off. They've had enough of this world. And they're just going to go off to the forest and drop their bodies. And Bhishma, who's ruling the kingdom in the midst of all this chaos, says, I think that's a really good idea for me too. He says, I can drop my body whenever I want. I've got this boon. I'm just going to leave with you. And Satyavati, with whatever strength she has left for this world, she turns and she says, you can't. And he realizes it's the voice of Dharma, it's the voice of truth. And so all of his yearning to just be done with this world, because remember, he's a Gandharva. He's a celestial being. This isn't his world. But with all, he realizes this is the voice of Dharma, and he simply says, okay, I'll stay. And they go off. But now the tension is impossible. And Duryodhana goes, there's nothing left to do. The righteous individual in this storyline is who? It's Yudhishthira. He's the obvious heir to the throne, and Dhritarashtra has no choice now but to crown him Yuvaraj. Yeah. And so Duryodhana goes to his father and he says, you will make us paupers and beggars within our own household. The Kauravas, if you make the Pandavas the heir to this throne, they will make us their slaves. And he says, I would rather die than be a slave to the Pandava brothers. And he cries and he weeps and he wails and he gnashes his teeth. And his father secretly feels completely aligned with this. He doesn't want, he doesn't want the Pandavas ruling. He wants his own son on the throne. And so Duryodhana with Sakuni, they hatch a plot. What's the plot? The plot is they're going to send all of the Pandavas off to another little kingdom over here as emissaries, as ambassadors from the house of Hastinapura. And of course, the Pandavas can see through this, but Yudhishthira, he says what he always says. He says, our father is dead. Dhritarashtra represents our father. His word is the word of the father, and we, for the sake of Dharma, we will simply go along with whatever he says. And so what's happened is, Duryodhana has created this plot that if he can get rid of them, he thinks if he can get rid of them for a year, and they're going to go off for a year as his ambassadors, if he can get rid of them for a year, that the local folks in the kingdom who adore the Pandavas will forget about them, and he'll have time to ingratiate himself, and pretty soon the loyalties will shift to him. They just kind of forget about it, but he's also hatched a second plot. And the second plot is that he sends Purachana. Purachana is his minion, his agent. He goes off to this other kingdom and he builds a house, a palace, because nothing in the town, in the kingdom is good enough for the Pandavas. He builds this beautiful, beautiful palace out of flammable materials. And then he digs a moat around it, ostensibly to protect the Pandavas from outside forces, but really to keep the Pandavas in. And then he fills the rooms with pots of expensive oils that are all very flammable, and he hides things in the walls. And he's determined that what's going to happen is as soon as he gets them there and they all settle in and time passes, he's just going to have them burned up, immolated inside this, and then he'll finally be rid of all the Pandavas, and voila, the kingdom will be his. Okay? So this is what we do. We try, you'll see throughout the story that the forces for spirituality are always trying to make peace, always trying to make it work. They're happy to share the kingdom. They love their cousins. And it would work, except that materiality cannot abide spirituality. It will not tolerate it in the kingdom at all. And so you see these two forces going back and forth. Let's stop, let's take a break, let's go get something to drink, and we'll come back and the story will continue. Okay. Stretch, breathe, try and shake off your dinner, which is his role out at the kingdom of Laurelwood. There's actually quite a few things that happen. One is that Bhishma realizes that these boys all need a tutor. And he brings in Kripa, which is one interpretation of the name of Kripa is Guru's grace, or grace. He brings in Kripa, and Kripa teaches them all equally, but he can only take them so far. He's a great noble soul. And Bhishma's been pondering what to do to help them because they're warrior sons. They're scions of a house, of a very noble house, and he's trying to figure out how he's going to get them trained. And one day they're out sporting and playing a game out in the courtyard, and they lose a ring into a well, and a ball falls in the well. Actually, the ball falls in the well, and they want to get it back. And they're all staring, they're all over this well looking like this, puzzling how to get the ball back out. And into their midst walks this tremendously powerful but very humbly dressed figure. And he looks over the well and says, "What are you looking for?" And they tell him what's happened. The ball has fallen in. He says, "You are the sons of this great and noble and royal house, and you don't even know how to get a ball out of a well?" And they look at him and says, "Well, you do it." And he simply says, "Fine." And he takes a ring off, this ring off of his finger, and he throws it into the well as well. And I said, "What are you going to do?" He says, "I'll show you how to get them both out." And he simply bends over and he starts taking grass and he weaves them together and he starts to spear them down into the water with these mantras. And he sends one down and it pierces the ball, and another one down, and another one down, and another one down, and it goes under the ring and scoops up. And he just keeps sending them down, and pretty soon he's got this rope of this grass, and he just pulls it up and hands him the ball, puts the ring back on his finger. And they're all going, oh my God, how did you do that? And he says, go and tell your grandfather what you've seen. And so they go running and they say, there's this incredible warrior with all these magic powers out front. And he said to come and tell you what we just saw. And they got our ball back, all this happened. And he says, oh, he knows who this is. This is Drona. And he says, bring him to me. And so they go and they bring Drona in. And Bhishma pays him great homage. He's heard who he is. He knows of his power. And he says, you are the one who I've been waiting for to train all of these teens together. Now, Drona represents a very important quality. What's that quality? Quality of habit. And habit will train both your bad qualities and your good qualities equally. It doesn't care, it just trains them all. So anyway, time passes, and Drona is taking them all under his wing, and they're all growing in power, in wisdom. He trains them in the mace, he trains them in the sword, he trains them in archery, he trains them in javelin, he trains them in the discus, he trains them in everything, he trains them in chariot. But Duryodhana and Bhima, they are particularly attuned to the mace. And Arjuna is particularly attuned to the bow. And Arjuna has single-pointed concentration. He's got a native ability and a hunger and a desire to learn this beyond anything that Drona's ever seen. And he practices all day and all night and all day and all night. And he'll take some little trick that Drona's tried to teach him, and he'll just practice it until he's so masterful. And he learns to shoot at night. He learns to shoot blindfolded. He learns to shoot back over his shoulder. He learns to shoot under every condition, left-handed, right-handed. Nothing is beyond him. And he's captured Drona's heart. But now Drona has a son. His son is Aswatthama, and Aswatthama is a great warrior. And he sees this natural affinity beginning to develop between his father and Arjuna. And Arjuna is becoming his favorite. And in fact, so much so that he promises at one point that Arjuna will become the greatest warrior and the greatest archer ever to exist. And of course, this swells Arjuna's ego a little bit. He's beginning to rely on this, and he can just see himself as being the greatest in the world. And so what happens to Aswatthama? And of course, Drona tries to make Aswatthama friends with Arjuna. Yeah, and what do teenagers do when your parents try and get you to do something? Exactly the opposite. So he becomes best friends with who? Duryodhana. Okay? So again, the tension is beginning to build. At one point, and this is one of the great little excerpts of stories. At one point in the archery training, Drona has all of the scions of the house from both sides line up with their bows and arrows. And he says to Yudhishthira, he says actually to one of the Kauravas, he says, kneel. And he places a bird, a very small icon of a bird, very far away, high up in the tree. And he says to the Kaurava son, he says, what do you aim and what do you see? And the Kaurava son says, I see the bird, I see the tree, I see the sky, I see the clouds, I see the wind blowing. And Drona looks at him and says, shoot. And he shoots and he misses. And he calls somebody else up, and he calls somebody else up, and they all see all these different things. And finally he calls up Duryodhana. And each time he says, you'll miss. He calls up Duryodhana, and he says, what do you see? And Duryodhana says, I see the bird, I see the tree, I see the leaves. And he says, shoot. You'll miss, but shoot. And he shoots, and of course he misses. And he's humiliated. He calls up Yudhishthira. Yudhishthira says, I see the bird. And again, he says, what else do you see? I see nothing but the bird. He says, shoot, but you'll miss. He misses. Finally, Arjuna's there. And Arjuna, this is one of those great moments. He says, Arjuna, what do you see? Arjuna says, I see the eye of the bird. He says, what else do you see? He says, I see nothing but the eye of the bird. He says, this, shoot. And of course, Arjuna shoots. Because it's that absolute single-pointed, unwavering, undeflected capacity to concentrate on a single point that makes for perfect archery. What's the technique that Yogananda's taught us? Hong Sa, technique of concentration. Arjuna, concentration. It's the gift of the Guru, coming all the way from this story. Anyway, that's a moment, the story of the eye of the bird. We left a figure. We're gonna come back now because we've left a figure dangling. And that figure we've left dangling is a small infant wrapped in beautiful silks, placed in a gorgeous box and set adrift on the river. And that child is the first child of Kunti through the god of the sun, through Surya. And that box drifted down the river. And after a time it got lodged in reeds. And dawn came, and a charioteer named Atirata was down by the river, fetching water for the morning meal. And he saw something out in the reeds, out in the river, that caught his eye, and he couldn't make out what it was, so he waded into the water. And it was this beautiful box filled with these silks wrapped around a child with golden earrings and a golden shield on his chest. And he looked around, he tried to see where could this child have come from, and he sees absolutely nothing. And so he gathers the child up in the box and he brings them to shore. And he feels in his heart that this is a divine gift, because he and his wife, Radha, have never been able to have a child. And they've prayed and prayed for years. And this feels like it's the divine response. And so he brings the child home. And he presents it to his wife. And tears fall from her eyes and her heart melts. And they raise the child as their own. And he becomes known as Radheya, the son of Radha. And he's this great and noble figure. And years pass. And on his 16th birthday, his mother comes out and finds him weeping on the back stairs. And she says to him, "My son, what's wrong?" And he looks up at her and he says, "Today is my 16th birthday and Father is going to honor me. He's bought me a chariot so that I can follow in his footsteps." Because it was a higher age and souls were drawn into family lineages that match their own dharmas. And so it was very natural for the father to bestow upon the son and to have the son come up and carry on the trade of the father and the business of the father and the life of the father, because that kind of attunement is natural in a higher age. And he says, "I don't know what's wrong with me, because I don't want to receive this gift. I don't feel that I'm a charioteer. I want to be a warrior. Why do I have this unnatural desire?" And all of a sudden, to his utter astonishment, his mother starts weeping and sits down beside him. And he says, "Mother, what's wrong?" And she says, "We've never told you this in all these years. But this is not, I'm sure, an unnatural desire." And then she tells him of having found him in silks in this river. And she says, "We've adopted you, we've raised you as our own, but surely you've come from a noble lineage and a noble household. And you are royal. Just look at you. And this, I'm sure, is your destiny." And she says, "You're a real mother." And Radheya stops her and says, "You are my real mother, whoever this other woman is." And then he tells her of his dream that he has night after night after night. He wakes up with this beautiful but veiled woman leaning over him, weeping hot tears. And they realize that this must be his memory of his mother. He says, "But she gave me up, and you have raised me. You are my true mother." But then he bids her adieu, because they both know that his calling is to go out and become a warrior. But a charioteer's caste is the blend of a kshatriya and a brahmin. And it's not a high caste, the marriage between a brahmin and kshatriya. And no one, no matter where he goes to be trained, no one will take him. No one will take him because he's low caste. And finally, in despair, he goes to Drona And Drona says, I'm sorry, you're a charioteer. You're noble, clearly, but I can't bring you into this household of nobility. I can't bring you into this. You're an unknown. You're a putra. You don't belong here. And he sends him away, which comes back to haunt everybody later. And finally, he hears of a great Brahmin who is a master and a guru in the arts of war, and he hates kshatriyas. And Bhargava is his name, and he goes to Bhargava, and he's desperate now because this is his last opportunity, this is his last chance. And so he goes to Bhargava and he says, I would like to be your student, I would like you to be my guru, I will do everything you say. And Bhargava can see his tremendous nobility, and he feels in him this righteousness. And he says, but what is your caste? And Radeya tells him a half-truth. He says, I'm a Brahmin. Which is half true, but it's half not true. Anyway, so he's accepted, and he is trained, and he quickly becomes Bhargava's favorite student. He is fabulous, native talent, and deep desire blend to become the perfect disciple of this great master of archery and the arts of war. And he quickly learns everything Bhargava can teach him. And Bhargava finally comes to him and says, my son, it's time for you to go off and make your way in this world because there's nothing left I have to teach you. And Radeya bows at his feet. And Bhargava says, you're clearly a righteous man and a noble man, and you'll have a glorious life. But Radeya feels uncomfortable inside because he knows that he started this whole thing with what? A half-truth. And Bhargava says, my son, would you run up to the kingdom and get me a pillow? I feel tired and I would sleep under this tree. And Radeya says, there's no need for me to go and get a pillow. Come, I will sit here and you can lay your head in my lap and I will be your pillow and you can rest as long as you'd like. And so Radeya just sits, Bhargava lays his head in his lap, and he just goes to sleep, and Radeya's just sitting there. But his heart is troubled, and as he's sitting there, this bug, this beetle, this vicious, and comes and starts to bore into the thigh of Radeya. And this nearly unendurable pain starts. But because his guru's head is in his lap, and all respect and all honor is due the guru, and he's received this enormous gift from Bhargava, he will not stir, he refuses to move. And pretty soon this bug has bored a hole into Radeya's leg, and the blood is flowing so freely that it wakes Bhargava, and he wakes up and there's blood everywhere, and he goes, my God, what's happening? And he looks up, and he sees the Karna's just sitting there, and he sees what's happening, and he says, all of a sudden this moment of realization washes over Bhargava. And he says, what's happening? And Radeya says, I didn't want to disturb you. He says, you're not moving with this thing on your leg. He says, you lied to me. You must be a kshatriya because no Brahmin has the self-control to endure this kind of pain. And so all of a sudden, Radeya is unmasked. And Bhargava does what rishis do. He turns and he says, you have received this under false pretenses. How dare you? I curse you now that when you most need these things I've given you, when you're facing your life's mortal enemy and you need these things I've taught you, you won't be able to remember them. And Karna's just crushed. Here he is, he's finally achieved all of the desire of his heart. He's just about to leave. He's got the blessings of his master. And all of a sudden, it's just undone. But the curse has been given. And again, the anger passes. And Bhargava says, but you will always be known as a noble and righteous man and the greatest giver that ever lives. But then he has to leave. And he leaves knowing that all of this training will come to naught in the final moments when he's needed. And this deep sadness and heaviness washes over him, and he's going back, and he doesn't know where to go. So he goes back to his family's home, his mother's home, and as he's on his way there, he's not really paying much attention. And he sees a deer and it's time for dinner, so he shoots the deer. Well, he wasn't really looking, and the deer is not really a deer. The deer is a cow. And the cow belongs to what? A rishi. And the rishi comes and sees him and says, "How dare you shoot this defenseless cow? I curse you now, that just as you have shot this defenseless cow when it couldn't protect itself, when you are having battle with your life's mortal enemy, your chariot wheel will become stuck in the mud. And as you get out to free your wheel, when you least are prepared for death, that is when it will find you." And Karna realizes he was born under a fated star, he says. But still, there's nothing to do but go out and live his life. And so he goes back home, and he just rests in the love of his mother. But you have to understand, Karna represents something. This is the great tragic character of the story, and it's the great tragic character of our lives. Karna, Radeya, Karna's his real name, he represents the desire for happiness in this world. Think about that. It's the most noble and beautifully born desire we ever have, the desire for happiness. It's the firstborn thing. We want happiness in this world. We want it in this world. And it's the in this world that causes it to be constantly cursed. Because this world is not designed to give us happiness through the conditions of this world. So you see this great nobility, this great, glorious, half-divine being. He's the eldest Pandava. But he doesn't know who he is. It's lost. He's lost his way. He's lost his connection to the light. Okay. So he goes back, and then finally, after resting in the arms of his mother for a period of time, he knows he has to go out and find his way, even with the curse. 2 curses. So time passes. And the boys are all becoming, back in Hastinapur, the boys are all becoming extraordinary warriors. They're growing up, their power is increasing, and they're glorious. And Drona has decided that it's time to have a great exhibition. And he announces it throughout all the kingdoms around, that the great scions of the house of Kuru, the Kauravas and the Pandavas, will have this great exhibition and show off the mastery. There's a chance for him to glorify himself. It's a chance to show off the greatness of these sons. And it's also a defensive tactic, because if the kings from around see how great these warrior sons are, they're far less likely to try and conquer the kingdom of Hastinapura. So it's got all these benefits, but he's secretly planning on really showing off Arjuna. This is really his chance to show off his favorite pupil and how extraordinary he is. But before the day happens, what happens is they're out riding in the woods. And remember, that Drona has promised that he will make Arjuna the greatest archer in the world. And they're out riding. And all of a sudden, this wild figure comes out of the woods. And he is dressed in barks and leaves and hides, and he's got dreadlocks everywhere, and he's just wild look in his eyes. And he comes running out of the woods, and he falls at Drona's feet. And he says, "My guru." And Drona stops, and he looks, and he says, "Who are you? And why do you call me your guru?" He says, "Because you are my master." And he says, "I don't know you. He says, I came to Hastinapura. My name is Ekalavya, and I came to Hastinapura years ago. And I asked you to take me and train me, but because I was low-born, you said I couldn't stay. But then I asked you for a blessing before I passed, and you blessed me. And I came back here, and I made a sculpture of you. And every day since that time, 24 hours a day, I have practiced in your presence, and I have drawn from that blessing, and I have pulled on the gift that you've given me of your presence and your power and your guidance. And Drona says, well, what have you learned? And then Ekalavya goes and he says, follow me. And he takes them into the place where he's been practicing. And there's the beautiful sculpture that he has of Drona. And in front of that sculpture and in front of his living guru now, he goes and he does things with the bow that even Arjuna could never imagine. And Drona is aghast. Because he remembers he's both totally impressed and overwhelmed at the proficiency, but he also remembers his promise. And he looks over at Arjuna, and Arjuna's face is downcast, and a shadow has crossed his face. And he looks at his guru and he says, how dare you betray me? All this time you've been training this disciple when you promised you would make me the greatest archer. And Drona finally realizes that the story of the house of Hastinapura, the storyline is about to be deflected. And he knows he must do something. And so he says to Ekalavya, he says, if I am your guru, then I ask for Guru Dakshina. I ask for the payment for my training. And Ekalavya says, anything, my guru. I'll give you my life if you wish it. He says, I want the thumb of your right hand. And without even hesitating, he takes a sharpened arrow and he just slices off the thumb of his right hand. Because the thumb is used in archery at that level. And he knows that if that's taken. But Ekalavya knows. Again, he's such a noble character. And it's one of the great things. This is one of those great stories. Because it talks about, one moment in the presence of a guru, one moment in the presence of a saint, if you really draw on it. It can be your raft over the ocean of delusion. It can give you the power for anything. And like Ekalavya, with single-pointed concentration, again drew on that and became absolutely free in what he was focused on. But it also talks about, the greatness of his soul because he didn't even hesitate. He says in that moment, he says, archery is not of the body, it is of the mind and the heart. And he knows. And so he just slices off his thumb and he presents it. And even though he's never as great an archer as he was, this nobility of his soul is completely liberated in that moment. So anyway, that's another little interlude. But now it's time to show off. It's time to show off Arjuna and all the brothers. And so they build this great presentation stand, this great arena, and all the seating and kings and princes and everybody comes from all over. And the day has come, the dawn is rising, and this great festive presentation is going on, and he has different brothers and different of the sons come out and present with the mace, and they come out and they present with the javelin, they come out and present with the sword, and they're all just doing, mock combat. But then it's time to present the mace, and out comes who? Bhima and Duryodhana, and they hate each other. They just can't stand each other. And they're both enormous presence. They're both masters of the mace. And they start by just doing, the practice blows. But pretty soon their animosity, their hatred grows and breaks open. And pretty soon they're in real combat. They're trying to destroy each other. And Drona finally has to go in and break them up. But it's become clear that things are not quite as calm and beautiful and simple as it was presented. But then it's time. And out comes Arjuna, and this is the moment, this is the coup de grace for the entire presentation. And he does things with the bow and arrow that nobody can imagine, and everybody is overawed. And just at the moment, when the climax has all come, and everything's great, there's a stir at the gates to the arena. And into the arena walks this great and noble soul. And he's got golden earrings. And he's got a golden shield. And he's got a bow slung across his back. And he walks up and he says, is this contest open to anyone? And the crowd sees how great he is. And they say, yes, it's open to anyone. And so he simply unslings his bow and he does everything Arjuna has done and more. And the crowd is going wild. The crowd is absolutely overawed. And then he looks and he says, clearly this is a contest only between Arjuna and myself. And he challenges Arjuna to single combat, to prove who's the better archer. And now Yudhishthira is concerned because he recognizes in Karna the greatness of Arjuna. But he sees that somehow this power has opposed Arjuna. And so the Pandavas say, well, and Bhima says it, but he says, if you're going to challenge, only Kshatriyas can fight. Kshatriyas, you have to be of an equal stature socially before you can contest. And we all know Arjuna's lineage. What is your lineage? And there's this hush, because Karna knows that he's been undone, because he knows what his lineage is. He's a Sutaputra. He can't possibly be in single combat. But at that moment, Duryodhana sees what he's got. He sees the power of Arjuna, but he sees the power of Arjuna, and even greater, opposing Arjuna. And he steps out and he says, nobility is not a matter of birth. Nobility is a matter of character. Nobility is, and there are people who are the lowest born who are the most noble figures, and this is clearly a noble soul. And he says, in fact, I have a kingdom in my power that has no king. And he says, I now will crown this man the king of that kingdom, and then he will be more than Arjuna's equal. And this coronation happens, and Karna is crowned the king, and the crowd is impressed with how noble a gesture that Duryodhana has just made. And now, instead of it being Arjuna's day, it's now Duryodhana's day, and now it's possible for these two great warriors to go in. And Yudhishthira is deeply concerned, and all the brothers are concerned, and Vidura is concerned, even because he can see that Duryodhana has the power now with Karna in his presence and in his court. And of course, Karna swears eternal fealty and loyalty to Duryodhana for this great gesture, because Karna's life has now been made because of Duryodhana's generosity. And so what we've got now is we've got the two powers. And it says that the sun comes out and it shines down on Karna, and the clouds come and they hover over Arjuna, and these two forces are beginning. All the gods come. They're going to come watch this great contest between these two great souls. And then, who should walk into the arena at this moment but Adirata and Radha? And Karna is so great of soul, so great of nature. Oh, I'm sorry. First, there's a little commotion up in the women's section. And Kunti has fallen in a faint. Because what? She has recognized her firstborn son. And Vidura comes over and he says, he knows what's happened because he's omniscient. He can see. And he says, you must not say anything. You must remain quiet. And so she doesn't say anything. And then Adirata and Radha come in. And Karna, this is his moment. He could repudiate them. He could completely ignore their presence and stand in his newly gained position. But he's so great of soul, he doesn't. He goes over and he falls at Adirata's feet and he says, Father. He falls at Radha's feet and he says, Mother. And then Bhima stands up and scoffs and he says, a Sutaputra against a Kshatriya. How dare they? And he mocks Karna. And they mock the low-born nature of Radheya. And there's this great uprising, this great stirring, and it's almost like a brawl is about to happen. And then the sun sets, and the day is over, and the contest is done. And Karna goes off with Duryodhana. But the day has gone completely opposite. Instead of it being a chance to show off Arjuna, what's happened now with Duryodhana is the star of the day. And Karna is the great white hope and the great hopeful figure in this whole story. So things are turning out very odd. And now we come to the moment where Drona says, it's time. It's time. I want payment for the service that I provided to the house of Hastinapura. I want Guru Dakshina. I want paid. And Bhishma had agreed to this in the very beginning. What does Drona want more than anything? Revenge. Revenge on who? Why? Because Drupada scorned Drona. And so he says to the boys, he says, what I want is I want you to go over to Panchala. I want you to conquer the kingdom. I want you to capture Drupada. I want you to tie him up and bring him back in your chariot. And all the boys go riding over And of course, the Kauravas are arrogant, and they say, we can do this, and we don't need the Pandavas to do this. And Duryodhana is just going to ride in. And of course, they get there, and the Pandavas agree they'll just sit aside. And Karna and all his, not Karna, but Karna, Duryodhana and all his brothers attack the kingdom with Karna and Dusasana and all these great warriors. But of course, Drupada is this great, powerful figure. And he just simply repels them. And he chases Duryodhana from the field, and they're humiliated. They come back. And then the Pandavas say, well, we'll go. And Arjuna says, I will go. And he simply rides in, and he's so great a warrior that he manages to conquer the army, best Drupada, capture him, tie him up, toss him in his chariot, and ride back. And so once again, the Pandavas have shown superiority. Duryodhana is humiliated. And they bring Drupada. Arjuna brings Drupada to Drona. And he says, here, we have paid our dakshina. This is what you asked for. And they present him. And Drona says, unbind him. And he goes up and he says, Drupada, my friend, I came to you to redeem your promise and ask for half the kingdom as you had said. And you scorned me. I now own it all. But I will be righteous and I will give you back half of the kingdom. He says, and I give you your freedom. He says, and now we can be friends. Of course, a Brahman's anger fires up, burns hot, and spends itself, and is gone. But they say that a Kshatriya's anger is slow and deep and burns forever. And now Drupada has been humiliated, and he has lost half of his kingdom. And he leaves there, and Drona just thinks it's all over. But Drupada leaves, and he has one thing in his mind. And what is that? Revenge. Okay? And he's decided that he wants two things. He wants a son powerful enough to kill Drona. And he wants a daughter beautiful enough to marry, and great enough to marry Arjuna, because even though Arjuna has bested him, he knows it wasn't personal, and Arjuna wasn't vengeful of himself. He was just paying back his guru. And he is so impressed with Arjuna's mastery, and he thinks it'll be a double blessing if he can get a daughter that will marry Arjuna, because then Arjuna will be loyal to him and not Drona. And so time passes. We got 25 minutes and a long way to go. Huh? You'll stay longer? Are you having fun with this?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay. So, it's now time to crown the Yuvaraj. And Yudhishthira is crowned because there's no choice. But again, Duryodhana goes to his father. And so we're back at that point again. He goes to his father and he says, we will become slaves in our own kingdom. How dare you? They decide to send the Pandava brothers as emissaries. The house of Lac is built. And Yudhishthira and the brothers, they all know this is dirty pool. They know that this is not right, but they don't know what's wrong with it yet. They just know that this is a scheme by Duryodhana, endorsed by Dhritarashtra, the father. And as they're leaving, Vidura comes up to Yudhishthira. So it's Kunti and the five brothers are leaving. Vidura comes up and he speaks to Yudhishthira. And he speaks to him in an ancient dialect that virtually nobody knows or uses anymore. And he speaks of dangers. And he speaks of poison. And he speaks of fire. And he says that rats can protect themselves from fire by burrowing underground. And that's all he says. And he turns and walks off. And Kunti says, what did Vidura say to you? And he says, he warned us of poison and he warned us of fire, but I think it's going to be fire. And so they go, and they come, and this great entourage arrives, and of course they land in this new town, and Purachana welcomes them on behalf of the kingdom and on behalf of the Kurus. And he says, nothing in this town is good enough, so we built you this beautiful palace for the nobility of the house of Hastinapura, for the great Pandavas. And so they go in, and it's this beautiful palace surrounded by this beautiful moat, but there's all these spikes in the moat, and they're all pointed in instead of out, right? And so they know something's really wrong with this. They come across the drawbridge, they come in, and the place is absolutely stunning, but it smells a little funny. There's something wrong. It doesn't feel right. And Yudhishthira has Bhima go around, and he has him check out the entire palace. And meanwhile, they're just being very quiet. They're just saying, this is so beautiful, we're so grateful. And Bhima comes back and he says, it's born to burn. He says, there are pots of oil everywhere, and it's made of flammable material. And they say, we should kill Puruchana now and go attack. But Yudhishthira says, no, it won't happen now. Because if it happened now, it would be too obvious that it was a plot by Duryodhana, and he won't risk the loyalty of the people of Hastinapura once we're settled in. And so they start spending more and more time out in the field away from the House of Black and camping in the fields and stuff. And then after a period of time, this man comes to Yudhishthira and he says, I am a miner and I have been sent to you. And Yudhishthira is very apprehensive. He's very concerned about another spy. But the man starts to speak to him in the same dialect that Vidura had used as they were leaving. And he says, I am a mining engineer, and I can build you a tunnel under this city out to the riverbanks as an escape route. And Yudhishthira says, but when it burns, won't they know? And he says, no, because I will build it so skillfully that when the house burns, it will collapse in and cover the tunnel, and no one will ever know. And so the brothers continue to spend more and more time away, and Puruchana is always with them so they don't leave. So in the midst of all this, the mining engineer builds a tunnel, and then finally he says, it's ready. And they know the time is coming close, that Puruchana is going to burn them out. So what they do is they invite Puruchana, but they know that if the house burns and there aren't bodies found, that everyone will know that something else has happened. So they invite Puruchana over for dinner. They decide to be proactive. They invite Puruchana over for dinner, and a widow and her 5 sons that have been helping Puruchana all this time. And they have a beautiful feast, and they lace the foods with poison. And then, once they're asleep, they simply gather themselves up, light the house on fire, and disappear into the tunnel. And in the morning, of course, the town sees this great conflagration, and they go to try and save the great Pandavas, but nobody can get close because of the moat and the stakes and how fast the house is going up. And there's this great lamentation, this great wailing, because now the great Pandavas have been burned to death. And there's this great sadness in the kingdom. And word goes back very quickly to Hastinapura. And in the morning they go through and kick through the ashes, and there they find, of course, the body of Puruchana and a woman and 5 great men. And they know that the Pandavas are dead, that it's finally happened. Meanwhile, and so of course in the kingdom back in Hastinapura, Duryodhana is just thrilled, he's just delighted. And Dhritarashtra is feeling relieved, and Shakuni's going, I told you it would work, and so on. But meanwhile, they escaped out through the tunnel, and they get to the river. And there by the river, they see a boatman, a ferryman. And the ferryman comes up and starts to speak to them in the same ancient dialect. And he says, I have been sent here to wait for you. My job is to ferry you across the river, and you are to go immediately to the forest. And so they ferry across the river, and they're racing in through the forest. And time passes, and it's been a long day. And Kunti becomes extremely fatigued. And she finally sits down and says, I can't go any farther. And everyone says, we can't stop here. You must. And so Bhima just simply picks her up and pops her on his back, and they're running down and then pretty soon, Sahadev and Nakula, and then Arjuna, and then even Yudhishthira, all become so fatigued they can't go on, but they're not in safe territory. So Bhima just picks them all up and tucks them all around him, and he's just running, and he's saving his brothers. It's just a great old time, and he's having a great time. Things are finally happening for him. And they go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into the woods. And finally they come in this deep, dark woods to a glade. And it's time. They're just all exhausted, and he feels like it's safe. So he puts them all down, and they're sleeping. But this particular forest belongs to a Rakshasa. I love that word, because it so completely is what it is. What is a Rakshasa? It's a demon. And the demon's name is Hidimba. And these are very powerful demonic beings, and they can change shape and they become more powerful at night, and they love to feast on human flesh and creatures. And Hidimba is hanging out with his sister Hidimbi, and they're just kind of there, and he's lolling and wondering what he can do for his next meal, and he's just thinking about his big kingdom in his forest, and he says to Hidimbi, "What is that I smell? I haven't smelled that for so long." It's the smell of human flesh, still alive. And he's lazy, and he says, "Hidimbi, go and fetch the humans for me, and I'll have them for my meal." And Hidimbi is intimidated by her brother, but she's also a powerful Rakshashi. And so she goes flying through the trees to where she follows the scent, and she gets to this glade. And there she sees all these humans laying around in a deep sleep, semi-coma, except for one. And he's enormous, and he's powerful. And she falls immediately in love with Bhima. And she changes into human form, and she becomes just excruciatingly beautiful. And she appears before him, and she says, "Excuse me, but this forest is owned by my brother, who is this evil Rakshasa, and he sent me to fetch you all there for his dinner. But I've come to warn you. You must flee, because he will come and he will kill you. He will eat you." And Bhima just looks at her, and he goes, "My goodness." And he's fallen immediately in love. He's smitten. But he says, and he just laughs at her story, he says, "A Rakshasa? What fear have I of a Rakshasa? Let him come." He says, "I will not disturb my mother and my brothers. They have had a big day and they deserve to sleep." And she pleads and she wheedles and she's afraid for his life because she's fallen in love. But he won't budge. And pretty soon, Hidimba's getting a little restive. He's a little bit uncomfortable, and he wants his meal, he's getting hungry, and where the heck is she? And he told her to go do something. Finally, he just stirs himself, and he comes and he finds them, and he's furious because there she is, and she hasn't done what he said. And he comes and he picks a fight with Bhima. And he just and Bhima he goes, "Finally, something to do." And this great, enormous battle rages. He draws him across, Bhima draws him across the meadow so it doesn't disturb the rest of them. And there's this enormous battle that ensues. And finally, it goes Hidimba and then Bhima and Hidimba and Hidimba and Bhima, and they get it back and forth. And finally, Bhima just simply grabs him and throws him up in the air. And as he's coming down, he snaps him across his knee, and Hidimba falls down dead. And there's this great sense of freedom in the forest that spreads as this demon as the forest is freed from the demon's influence. But now they're in an odd place because they don't have any place to go. They're deep in this forest. They are lost to all of the outer world. And Hidimbi can't really go anywhere else. This is her kingdom. This is where she lives. And so she and Bhima decide to get married. And the family will be housed up in the trees, and Hidimbi will rule the Rakshasas, and Bhima becomes crowned because he's killed the last Rakshasa king. He becomes the new Rakshasa king, and Vrikodara, I think, is his name, and he ends up taking on the kingdom, and he's ruling. And he's really happy about all this. The rest of the family is really nervous because every night the Rakshasas come out, and they just as soon eat the family, but he has to protect them, so they're up in a tree, and all this is going on. And meanwhile, they're hiding out. And in the course of time, Hidimbi becomes pregnant. And she becomes pregnant and gives birth to a child. And his name is Ghatotkacha. And Ghatotkacha is got all the power of Bhima, who's half divine, plus all the powers of the Rakshasas. So he's this enormous character. And time passes, but it's clear. And in fact, when they get married, Bhima says to her, this can't last forever. And when our son becomes 1 year old, he will become crowned the Yuvaraj, or the heir apparent of the Rakshasas, and we will have to leave. And so time passes, and of course, Gatakacha becomes a year old, and it becomes time for the family to move on. There's this great lamenting, but it's clear that Gatakacha will play a role later on, and Hidimbi will raise him, and he will be the king of the Rakshasas in the meantime. And so there's a side story that's going on. The brothers have to go on, the family has to go on, and they go on to a town of Ekachakra. And Ekachakra is just a small village at the edge of the forest. And they disguise themselves as Brahmins. Remember, they're Kshatriya warriors. And they disguise themselves as Brahmins. And they go around begging for their meals. And they're taken in by a Brahmin family. And they're given a little hut behind the main house to live. And the family that's taken them in is very, very kind. And the village adopts them. And they go out, and every day they go out begging for their food. And every day they come back. And everything's fine, everything's lovely. It's really working for everybody. Every day they come, except that every day they come back, and they say to their mother, Mother, look what we have received from begging. And she says, okay, share it equally among you. But share it equally among you means that Bhima gets half of it and everybody else shares the other half. And he's always hungry, and there's never quite enough for everybody. And a local potter makes him a very large begging bowl. And so now Bhima goes out with this very large begging bowl, and everybody's very taken with this, and they fill it all up. And so now everything's working out okay. And everything's just fine, except that it's, again, time is passing. And what's happening is these warrior brothers are beginning to feel a little bit unsettled at being in this state. And they know that something has to break. And meanwhile, Hastinapura is just thinking, Pandavas are dead, everything's great, wonderful. And one day, all the brothers except for Bhima are gone, and Kunti. And Kunti hears crying in the house. And she's concerned because these people have taken them in and cared for them. And so she goes up and she listens, and she hears the father saying, I'm the head of this household, it should be me. My job is to care for you all, I should be the one. And the wife says, I will just become a widow. How can I possibly care for the children and myself? I should be the one. And the daughter says, I will simply go to my husband's home. I will leave this family. I should be the one. I'm going to leave anyway. And the little boy says, I should be the one because I'm just tiny and useless and there's nothing else I can do. And they all sob and they all cry, and then they all decide that they're all going to go together. And Kunti is very puzzled by this, but she says, so she goes in and she says, I'm sorry for intruding on your sorrow, but I couldn't help but hear. Can you tell me what's going on? And it turns out there is a Rakshasa who lives in the area, who came into the area, and he has terrorized the town. And they finally made a deal with the Rakshasa because he would just wantonly come in and destroy and kill and eat the people and eat things and take cattle and stuff. They made a deal with him that once a week, the entire town would come together and they would draw straws. And the short straw, that person or that family would offer one person. That person would, the whole town would cook an enormous feast and load it on a cart, and that one person would drive the cart out to the Rakshasa. And they would feed the Rakshasa would eat all the food on the cart, and then he would kill and eat the person. And the family had drawn the straw this time. And so they didn't know what to do with it, and so they were all going to go. And Kunti says, I have 5 sons. I can afford to lose one. Let me offer one of my sons into this. Because she knows Bhima's getting a little restless, and she knows that what she's got. And they say, oh, no, we could never allow this. And she says, no, I insist. And then all the brothers come back, and she tells him, Yudhishthira is outraged. He says, Mother, how dare you? You know that we need, first of all, he's our brother, but also we need him to, this is what we're relying on when the war comes to reclaim the kingdom. And she says, and Bhima just laughs, and they decide that this is the right thing to do. So they finally go along, and Bhima, he's really excited by this. Because not only is he going to go get to wrestle and take out a Rakshasa, but he gets a whole cartload of food, and he's been hungry for a really long time. So he gets on the cart, and he goes rolling out. And he gets very close to where the Rakshasa's cave is, and he stops and he thinks, I'm gonna fight this Rakshasa, but in the fight, I'm gonna be defiled, and I won't be able to eat this food. I won't be clean to eat this food. So he just stops. He just starts eating the food right there. And the Rakshasa is waiting and waiting and waiting. Pretty soon, he hears this noise, and he comes out, and there's this big human being sitting on the cart. Instead of cowering in fear, he's just eating all the food. So, this Rakshasa starts to try and go after Bhima, but Bhima just holds him off and says, I'm not done yet. And he finishes the food, and he says, no, I'm ready. And there's this great battle. It goes on back and forth. And of course, by the time it's all said and done, Bhima has taken and tossed him up in the air and snapped him. And another Rakshasa has gone by the wayside. And there's the freedom of, the town is freed and there's great rejoicing. But when he comes back, they know that this may blow their cover. And so they get the family to promise to not say anything. And so, the people are asking, how did this great Rakshasa die? How are we liberated? And this rumor just goes out that, some great being came through and took care of it. But they know that discovery is inevitable. There's only 4 human beings on the planet that have the power to exercise this kind of will and capacity to protect and destroy a Rakshasa like that, and Bhima is one of them. So they're a little concerned about this. Meanwhile, we have 4 minutes left. I am going to stop right there. Balarama is one. There's a king, and then there's the brother of the king of Virata, who we run into later in the exile. Okay. Yeah. So, meanwhile, just as a teaser, what's happened? Does anybody remember Amba? Does anybody remember Drupada's desire?
Yes.
What's his desire? But he wants it in 2 ways. Remember how he wants it? He wants to have a son strong enough to destroy Drona, and he wants a daughter to marry Arjuna. Okay, magnetic and beautiful enough to marry Arjuna. So, what's happened in the meantime, we'll end with this, is Drupada has gone off and done this great yajna, this great offering, ceremonial offering and tapasya for this long period of time. And at the end of that yajna, what happens is a ceremonial fire is built, and out of the fire steps this enormously magnificent son and this radiant daughter, and they are fire-born. And he has finally a son who is born to destroy Drona, and a daughter beautiful enough and worthy enough of Arjuna. Now, it's Drishtadyumna and Drupadi. So Drupadi, daughter of Drupada, and Drishtadyumna. Drupada represents extreme dispassion. And from extreme dispassion comes the calm inner light, and the Kundalini is born. So she represents the Kundalini force. And there's great stories. There's really fun stuff that happens it's just getting interesting now. Okay, so we will leave it because an invitation happens, a really remarkable ceremony happens, and the brothers find a way to return to the kingdom. Coming soon to a theater near you. Okay. Any questions? Any thoughts? Huh? The miniseries? This is the miniseries. Yeah, 100,000 verses. This is the real miniseries. Okay, let's take a moment of silence together.